Blood dripped onto the hay-strewn floor of the barn as Bethany Evans struggled to keep her eyes open, the searing pain in her side making each breath a battle. Her own husband, the man who had vowed to love and protect her until death did them part, had left her here to die, his final words still ringing in her ears. "Nobody will ever find you here." The year was 1876, and life in the Montana Territory was as unforgiving as the winter winds that howled across the plains. Bethany had been married to Harold Evans for 5 years, years that had slowly transformed from hopeful beginnings into a nightmare of control and violence. The small homestead they shared 10 miles outside of Willow Creek had become her prison, and tonight, it seemed, would be her tomb. She couldn't remember how long she had been lying there, blood seeping from the knife wound in her side. Harold had been drinking again, his temper flaring over the supper she had prepared. The argument had escalated, and when she threatened to leave him, he had grabbed the hunting knife from his belt. The rest was a blur of pain and terror, ending with him dragging her to the barn and leaving her among the hay bales to bleed out, alone and forgotten. "Help," she whispered, though she knew no one would hear. Their nearest neighbor was miles away, and Harold had ridden off, probably to the saloon in town to establish his alibi. Darkness crept at the edges of her vision, and she felt herself slipping away. The sound of the barn door creaking open barely registered in her fading consciousness. Heavy footsteps approached, and a shadow fell across her face. With the last of her strength, Bethany forced her eyes open, expecting to see Harold returning to finish what he had started. Instead, she found herself looking up at a stranger, a tall man silhouetted against the lantern light. He knelt beside her, his expression shifting from surprise to concern as he took in her bloodied form. "Madam, can you hear me?" The voice was deep, gentle. Unlike anything she had heard from a man in years, Bethany tried to speak, but only a weak moan escaped her lips. The stranger quickly assessed her wound, his movements efficient but careful. "I'm going to help you," he said, removing his bandana and pressing it against her side. "My name is Xavier Whitfield. I was tracking a stray horse when I saw the light in your barn." He lifted her gently, cradling her against his chest. "You're safe now. You're home now." Those were the last words Bethany heard before darkness claimed her completely. When she awoke, Bethany found herself in an unfamiliar room, sunlight streaming through a window covered with simple gingham curtains. She was lying in a bed, clean and bandaged, dressed in a nightgown that wasn't her own. For a moment, panic seized her. Where was she? Where was Harold? "Easy now," came that same deep voice from the barn. The man Xavier moved into her line of sight, carrying a cup of water. "You've been through hell, madam. Best not to move too quick." Xavier Whitfield was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 30 to her 24 years. His face was tanned and weathered from life outdoors, with striking blue eyes that watched her with concern. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and a beard that was neatly trimmed. "Where am I?" Bethany managed to ask, her throat dry and voice raspy. "My ranch about 15 miles south of Willow Creek," Xavier explained, helping her sit up enough to sip the water. "I couldn't take you back to your place, not with your condition, and I reckoned whoever did this to you might come back." The memories flooded back, and Bethany's hand instinctively went to her side. "My husband," she whispered. "He tried to kill me." Xavier's expression hardened. "I figured as much. No wild animal makes a wound like that." He set the cup down on the bedside table. "Sheriff Tanner's been notified. He'll be coming by later today to talk to you if you're up to it." Bethany nodded, though fear clutched at her heart. What would happen when Harold discovered she was alive? Where would she go? She had no family in the territory, no money of her own. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saving my life." Xavier shook his head. "No need for thanks. Any decent man would have done the same." He stood up, towering over the bed. "Rest now. Mrs. Carter from down the way helped get you cleaned up and changed. She'll be back later to check on you. I've got some chores to tend to, but I'll be close if you need anything." As he turned to leave, Bethany called out, "Mr. Whitfield." He paused at the door. "Xavier, please." "Xavier," she repeated. "How long have I been here?" "2 days," he answered. "You lost a lot of blood, but the doc says you're strong. You'll heal given time." 2 days. Harold would surely be looking for her by now, if only to finish what he had started. The thought made her tremble. Xavier seemed to read her mind. "Don't worry about your husband," he said, his voice taking on a steely edge. "Sheriff Tanner's got men watching your property. If Evans shows his face, they'll bring him in." With that, he left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Bethany sank back against the pillows, exhaustion claiming her once more. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without fear. The next few days passed in a haze of sleep, medicine, and brief conversations with Mrs. Carter, a kindly widow who lived on the neighboring ranch. The doctor visited twice, expressing satisfaction with her recovery. Sheriff Tanner, a gruff man with a silver mustache, took her statement, promising that Harold would face justice when they found him. "He's disappeared," the sheriff explained on his second visit. "Took his horse and some supplies. We found blood in your barn and the house, if Whitfield hadn't found you when he did." He left the sentence unfinished. "What happens now?" Bethany asked, sitting up in bed, stronger now than she had been days ago. "We keep looking," Sheriff Tanner said. "As for you, madam, that's for you to decide. Do you have family you can go to?" Bethany shook her head. "My parents died 2 years ago. I have a sister in St. Louis, but we haven't spoken in years." The admission brought a fresh wave of loneliness. "Well, Whitfield says you're welcome to stay here until you're healed up proper," the sheriff said, putting on his hat. "He's a good man, one of the best in these parts. Lost his wife to fever 3 years back. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's fair and honest." After the sheriff left, Bethany found herself pondering her situation. She had been dependent on a man, first her father, then Harold, her entire life. The thought of standing on her own was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. Later that afternoon, she managed to get out of bed and make her way slowly to the window. Xavier's ranch spread out before her, a modest operation with a corral, a barn, and what looked like good grazing land stretching toward distant mountains. A few cattle dotted the landscape, and closer to the house, chickens pecked in a fenced yard. The door opened behind her and Xavier entered, stopping short when he saw her standing. "Should you be up?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Bethany turned, one hand braced against the windowsill for support. "I needed to move," she explained. "I've been in that bed for days." Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Cabin fever, I know it well." He gestured to the chair near the window. "At least sit if you're determined to be up." She complied, grateful for his lack of insistence that she returned to bed. Up close, she could see that he had been working hard. His shirt was damp with sweat, and there was dirt on his hands and face. "I brought you something," he said, producing a book from behind his back. "Found it in town. Thought you might want something to pass the time." He handed her a copy of Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Bethany took the book, touched by the thoughtful gesture. "I love this story," she admitted. "I had a copy once, but—" She trailed off, not wanting to explain that Harold had burned it in the stove one winter night in a fit of anger over her wasting time with foolishness. Xavier seemed to understand without her needing to explain. "Supper will be ready in an hour," he said. "Think you might feel up to joining me at the table? Mrs. Carter left a stew." The simple invitation felt momentous. "I would like that," Bethany said. "Thank you." That evening marked a turning point. Dressed in borrowed clothes that Mrs. Carter had brought, a simple skirt and blouse that had belonged to her daughter, Bethany sat across from Xavier at his kitchen table. The stew was hearty and flavorful, the bread fresh from Mrs. Carter's oven. The conversation was stilted at first, but as the meal progressed, they found common ground in their love of books and music. "My mother taught piano," Bethany shared, surprising herself with the personal revelation. "She insisted I learn, even though we could barely afford the upkeep of the instrument." Xavier smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face. My father played the fiddle. Not well, mind you, but with enthusiasm. Used to have the neighbors over for dances in our barn back in Ohio. How did you end up in Montana? She asked, curious about this man who had saved her life. Xavier's expression grew more somber. War brought me west. After Gettysburg, I couldn't stomach going home, drifted for a while, then worked cattle drives in Texas. Saved enough to buy this place 5 years ago. He didn't elaborate on his wife, and Bethany didn't press. As the days passed, Bethany's strength returned. She began to help around the house, at first with small tasks like shelling peas or folding laundry, then graduating to cooking meals and tending the kitchen garden. Xavier never asked her to work, always insisting she was a guest, but the activity gave her purpose and distracted her from thoughts of Harold. One morning, about 2 weeks after Xavier had found her, Bethany was hanging laundry on the line when she saw riders approaching. Her heart hammered in her chest. Had Harold found her, Xavier emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, positioning himself between her and the approaching men. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Sheriff Tanner leading the group. Whitfield, the sheriff called as they drew near. Mrs. Evans? Xavier lowered his rifle but didn't set it aside. What brings you out, Sheriff? Sheriff Tanner dismounted, his expression grim. We found Harold Evans, he announced, or what was left of him. Bethany's legs gave way and she sank onto a nearby stump. Xavier moved to her side, a steadying presence. What happened? Xavier asked, his voice tense. Looks like he tried to cross the river during the storm last week, Sheriff Tanner explained. Found his body washed up near Miller's Crossing yesterday, horse drowned with him. The news should have brought relief, but Bethany felt only a hollow emptiness. Harold had been a cruel husband, but once in the beginning there had been love, or what she had thought was love. Now he was gone, and she was a widow at 24. There's something else, the sheriff continued, pulling a folded document from his vest. We searched your homestead, Mrs. Evans, found this hidden in the floorboards. He handed the paper to Bethany. With trembling hands, she unfolded it, Xavier reading over her shoulder. It was a deed, showing that Harold had mortgaged their property to cover gambling debts. The loan was overdue, the property forfeit, banks claiming it, Sheriff Tanner said sympathetically. They're giving you 2 weeks to collect your personal belongings before they auction it off. Bethany stared at the document, the full weight of her situation crashing down on her. She was alone, homeless, and nearly penniless. The small amount of money she had managed to hide from Harold over the years would barely last a month. After the sheriff and his men left, Bethany sat on the porch steps, trying to make sense of her new reality. Xavier settled beside her, respecting her silence for a long moment before speaking. You can stay here, he offered simply, for as long as you need. She turned to look at him, studying his face for any sign of ulterior motive, but found only sincerity. Why would you do that? You barely know me. Xavier looked out across his land, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I know what it's like to lose everything, he said quietly. After Catherine died, I nearly gave up. If it hadn't been for neighbors helping me through, I might not be here. It was the first time he had mentioned his wife by name, and Bethany sensed the deep wound that still lingered. I don't want to be a burden, she said. You're not, he assured her. Truth is, this place could use a woman's touch, and I could use the help if you're willing to work. The arrangement can be temporary just until you figure out your next step. The offer was generous, more than she could have hoped for. Thank you, she whispered. I accept. The following day, Xavier drove Bethany to her old homestead in his wagon. The journey was tense, memories of her life with Harold flooding back with each familiar landmark. When they crested the final hill and the small cabin came into view, Bethany's breath caught in her throat. It looked smaller than she remembered, more run down. The garden she had tended was overgrown, the fence around the yard broken in places. Inside, the cabin felt cold and empty despite the summer heat. Harold's presence lingered in every corner. Take whatever you want, Xavier said, standing awkwardly by the door. We've got room in the wagon. Bethany moved through the rooms, gathering clothing, a few books that had survived Harold's temper, her mother's china teacup, and the quilt her grandmother had made for her wedding. In the bedroom, she hesitated before the small wooden box hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Inside were her most precious possessions, her mother's cameo brooch, letters from her sister, and the small amount of money she had managed to save. As she packed these items, a shadow fell across the doorway. Xavier stood there, holding something in his hands. "Found this in the barn," he said, extending a wooden picture frame toward her. It contained a photograph of Bethany with her parents and sister, taken before she had married Harold. "Thought you might want it." Bethany took the photograph, tears welling in her eyes. She had forgotten about this picture, hidden away when Harold had forbidden her to display it, claiming he was her family now. "Thank you," she said, carefully wrapping it in a shawl and placing it in her trunk. They left before noon, Bethany not once looking back as the wagon rolled away from the place that had been both home and prison. As they traveled, Xavier pointed out landmarks on his property, explaining his plans for expanding the herd and adding more grazing land. "The ranch isn't much," he admitted, "but it has potential." Bethany watched him as he spoke, noting the pride in his voice. This land was more than property to him, it was a dream, a future he was building. For the first time since Xavier had found her in the barn, Bethany allowed herself to consider what her own future might hold. Life at Xavier's ranch quickly fell into a rhythm. Bethany took over the household duties, cooking meals that were a far cry from Xavier's bachelor fare, keeping the cabin clean and organized, and tending to the garden with renewed enthusiasm. Xavier worked from dawn to dusk, caring for the cattle, mending fences, and making improvements to the property. They maintained a respectful distance, Xavier always conscious of her recent widowhood and trauma. He never entered her room, which had once belonged to his wife, and was unfailingly polite in their interactions. Evenings were spent in companionable silence by the fire, Xavier often reading aloud from one of his books while Bethany sewed or mended. As summer turned to fall, Bethany found herself watching Xavier when he wasn't aware, noticing the way the sun had darkened his skin, how his hands, though calloused from work, were gentle with the animals. She caught him watching her too, his blue eyes quickly darting away when she looked up. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the ranch in white overnight. Bethany awoke to find Xavier already gone, tracks in the snow leading toward the barn. She dressed quickly and prepared breakfast, worry gnawing at her when he didn't return as the morning wore on. Finally, just before noon, the door burst open and Xavier stumbled in, carrying a newborn calf in his arms. His coat was covered in snow, his face red from the cold. "Mama died," he explained breathlessly, laying the calf near the fireplace. "Found her too late, calf's barely breathing." Without hesitation, Bethany helped him, bringing blankets to warm the animal and preparing milk to feed it. Together, they worked through the afternoon, taking turns rubbing the calf's limbs to stimulate circulation and coaxing it to drink from a makeshift bottle. As evening fell, the calf finally stood on wobbly legs, a small victory that left them both smiling with relief. Xavier's hand found Bethany's, squeezing gently in shared triumph. The touch, simple as it was, sent warmth coursing through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "We make a good team," Xavier said softly, his eyes meeting hers. Bethany nodded, not trusting her voice. Something had shifted between them in those hours of working together, a recognition of compatibility, of shared purpose. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the wind howl outside, Bethany confronted feelings she had been avoiding. She was attracted to Xavier, drawn to his quiet strength, his kindness, his respect for her as a person. But was it too soon? Was she simply transferring her dependence from one man to another? The questions kept her awake until dawn, when she rose to find Xavier already gone again, this time to check on the rest of the herd. The day passed slowly, Bethany working methodically through her chores while tending to the calf they had named Hope, When Xavier returned that evening, he brought news from town. "Ran into Sheriff Tanner," he said over supper. "Your husband's creditors are still looking for payment. They're claiming you're responsible for his debts." Bethany set down her fork, appetite gone. "But I had no idea about the loans," she protested. "How can they expect me to pay?" Xavier's expression was grim. "Law's not always fair to women, especially widows." "But Tanner says there might be a way out. The bank manager is willing to consider the debt settled if you sign over any claim to the homestead and its contents." "I have nothing left there that matters," Bethany said firmly. "Tell Sheriff Tanner I'll sign whatever they need." Xavier nodded, relief evident in his face. "There's something else," he added, his tone shifting. "Town's hosting a harvest dance next Saturday. Thought you might like to go get acquainted with more folks around here." The invitation surprised her. "Are you asking me to accompany you?" "If you'd like," Xavier replied, a hint of nervousness in his usually confident demeanor. "No pressure, of course. Mrs. Carter would be happy to take you if you'd prefer." Bethany considered the offer. A social outing would mean facing the town's curiosity, the inevitable whispers about her situation. But it would also be a step toward establishing her own identity in this new place. "I would be honored to accompany you," she said finally. The smile that spread across Xavier's face was worth any discomfort the dance might bring. The following days were filled with preparation. Mrs. Carter arrived with fabric for a new dress, insisting it was a gift to welcome Bethany to the community. Together, they sewed a simple but elegant gown of deep blue wool, with lace at the collar and cuffs. On the night of the dance, Bethany stood before the small mirror in her room, hardly recognizing the woman reflected back at her. The bruises that had marked her face when Xavier found her were long gone, her complexion healthy from fresh air and good food. The dress emphasized her slim waist and brought out the blue in her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt beautiful. When she emerged from her room, Xavier was waiting by the fire, dressed in his best suit, his dark hair neatly combed. The look on his face when he saw her sent a flush of pleasure through her body. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Thank you," she replied, accepting the shawl he held out for her. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, a brief contact that left her skin tingling. The town hall was decorated with autumn leaves and harvest bounty, lanterns casting a warm glow over the assembled community. Heads turned when Xavier and Bethany entered, curious eyes taking in the newcomer on the rancher's arm. To Bethany's relief, the reception was warmer than she had anticipated. Mrs. Carter had apparently prepared the way, and women approached with genuine welcome, introducing themselves and their families. Men tipped their hats respectfully, though a few cast disapproving glances, no doubt judging her for moving on so quickly after her husband's death. Xavier stayed close, his presence a comforting shield against any potential unpleasantness. When the band struck up a waltz, he turned to her with a questioning look. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Evans?" The use of her married name was a jarring reminder of her past. "Bethany," she corrected softly. "Just Bethany, please." Understanding flickered in his eyes. "Bethany," he repeated, offering his hand. She took it, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. Xavier proved to be a competent dancer, guiding her smoothly through the steps. His hand at her waist was respectful, maintaining the proper distance, but Bethany found herself wishing he would hold her closer. "You dance well," she commented as they twirled among the other couples. "Catherine insisted I learn," he replied, a hint of sadness crossing his features at the mention of his wife. "Said a man who could manage a wild horse should be able to manage a simple waltz." The reference to his late wife reminded Bethany of the ghost that stood between them. "Tell me about her," she said impulsively, "if you don't mind." Xavier's steps faltered slightly before he regained his rhythm. "She was a schoolteacher," he said after a moment. "Smart as a whip with a laugh that could light up a room. We met in Colorado, married a year later. Had 3 good years together before the fever took her." Bethany heard the love in his voice, the lingering grief. She sounds wonderful. She was, Xavier agreed. She'd have liked you, I think. You have the same quiet strength. The comparison was flattering, though Bethany wasn't sure she deserved it. I don't feel very strong, she admitted. Most days I'm just trying to keep going. Xavier's grip tightened slightly at her waist. That's what strength is, he said firmly. Continuing on when it would be easier to give up. The dance ended, but they remained on the floor as the band began a slower tune. This time, Xavier drew her a fraction closer, still proper but intimate enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. I'm glad you came tonight, he murmured, his breath stirring the hair near her temple. So am I, she replied, allowing herself to relax into his lead to enjoy the moment without analyzing it. They danced until midnight, taking breaks only to accept refreshments or speak with neighbors. By the time they climbed into Xavier's wagon for the journey home, Bethany's feet ached pleasantly, and her heart felt lighter than it had in years. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Xavier helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Thank you for tonight, Bethany said, looking up at him in the moonlight. I can't remember the last time I enjoyed myself so much. Xavier's expression was soft as he gazed down at her. You deserve joy, Bethany, he said simply. Then, with a gentleness that made her heart ache, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Good night. He turned away, heading to the barn to tend to the horse, leaving Bethany standing on the porch, her hand still tingling from the touch of his lips. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that she was falling in love with Xavier Whitfield. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with a quiet determination. She would not rush, would not push, but neither would she deny the feelings growing within her. For the first time in her adult life, Bethany was making a choice based on her own desires, not on necessity or fear. Winter settled over the ranch with a vengeance in the weeks following the harvest dance. Heavy snowfalls isolated them, making trips to town impossible. Xavier worked tirelessly to keep the cattle fed and the buildings cleared, often returning to the cabin with his clothes frozen stiff and his beard rimmed with ice. Bethany met him each day with hot coffee and warm meals, concerned for his well-being growing as the temperature dropped. When he developed a cough that worsened with each passing day, she put her foot down. You need rest, she insisted one evening as Xavier struggled to remove his boots, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. The cattle will survive one day without you checking every single one. Can't afford to lose any, he argued, though his voice was hoarse and his eyes fever-bright. Winter's just beginning. Bethany crossed her arms, channeling the determination she had seen in her mother whenever her father had been stubborn about his health. And you'll be no good to them dead from pneumonia. Bed now, Xavier, doctor's orders. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Didn't know you were a doctor. I'm the closest thing you've got with doctor. Miller snowed over in Willow Creek, she retorted, helping him to his feet and guiding him toward his bedroom. It was the first time she had entered his private space, a simply furnished room dominated by a large bed with a patchwork quilt. Photos of his parents and one of him with a pretty blonde woman, Catherine, she assumed sat on the dresser. Xavier sank onto the edge of the bed, clearly too exhausted to protest further. Bethany helped him remove his coat and outer layers, maintaining a clinical detachment despite the intimacy of the situation. I can manage the rest, he said when she reached for the buttons of his shirt. Bethany nodded, stepping back. I'll bring you some hot broth and willow bark tea for the fever. She spent the night in a chair beside his bed, cooling his forehead with damp cloths as the fever raged. In his delirium, he called for Catherine, the anguish in his voice breaking Bethany's heart. Other times he spoke to her, clutching her hand and making her promise not to leave. I'm here, she assured him, stroking his hair back from his forehead. I'm not going anywhere. By morning, the fever had broken, leaving Xavier weak but lucid. He blinked up at Bethany, confusion giving way to realization as he took in her rumpled appearance and the basin of water beside the bed. "You stayed all night," he said, his voice rough. "Of course I did," she replied, helping him sit up to drink some water. "You were very ill." Xavier caught her hand as she adjusted his pillow. "Thank you," he said, his gaze intense despite his weakened state. "For caring." The simple gratitude touched her deeply. "Rest now," she urged, gently extracting her hand from his. "I'll check on the animals." Despite his protests, Bethany bundled herself in Xavier's spare coat and ventured out to the barn. The cattle were fine, the horses content in their stalls. She managed to feed them all and even milk the cow, though the task took her twice as long as it would have taken Xavier. When she returned to the house, cheeks flushed with cold and exertion, she found Xavier attempting to get out of bed. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, setting down the milk pail and rushing to his side. "Heard you come in," he explained, swaying slightly on his feet. "Wanted to make sure you were all right." Bethany guided him back to the bed, torn between exasperation and tenderness. "I'm perfectly capable of feeding a few animals," she said, tucking the quilt around him. "Now stay put, or I'll tie you to this bed." A mischievous light entered Xavier's eyes, despite his illness. "Is that a threat or a promise?" he asked, the hint of flirtation catching her off guard. Bethany felt her face heat with a blush that had nothing to do with the cold. "Behave yourself, Mr. Whitfield," she admonished. Though she couldn't keep the smile from her voice for 3 days, Xavier was confined to bed, Bethany tending to both him and the ranch with equal dedication. By the 4th day, his fever was gone, though the cough lingered. He insisted on resuming some of his duties, and Bethany reluctantly agreed, on the condition that he limit himself to the necessary tasks and allow her to help. Working side by side in the barn, they developed a new rhythm, Xavier teaching Bethany the skills she hadn't learned during her years on her own homestead. Harold had never allowed her to participate in the men's work, insisting her place was in the house. With Xavier, there were no such arbitrary divisions. "You're a natural with the horses," he commented one afternoon as Bethany confidently led his mare back to her stall. "Most city-raised women are afraid of them." "I always loved animals," Bethany admitted. "My father kept horses for his delivery business. I used to sneak out to the stables when my mother thought I was practicing piano." Xavier laughed, the sound warming her more effectively than the winter sun. "Rebellious even then," he teased. The easy camaraderie that developed between them during this time marked another shift in their relationship. The boundaries of employer and employee, rescuer and rescued, began to blur, replaced by something closer to partnership. As Christmas approached, Bethany threw herself into preparations, determined to make the holiday special. She baked cookies using precious sugar saved from their rations, decorated the cabin with evergreen boughs, and secretly worked on a gift for Xavier, a new scarf knitted from wool she had asked Mrs. Carter to bring on her last visit. On Christmas Eve, they sat before the fire after a simple but satisfying dinner. Outside, snow fell steadily, the world quiet save for the occasional crack of a log in the fireplace. "I have something for you," Xavier said, reaching beneath his chair and producing a small, wrapped package. "It's not much, but—" Bethany accepted the gift, touched by the gesture. Carefully unwrapping the brown paper, she revealed a small wooden box, intricately carved with a pattern of flowers and vines. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "Open it," Xavier urged, watching her intently. Inside the box was a silver locket, simple but elegant. Bethany lifted it out, her hands trembling slightly. "It was my mother's," Xavier explained. "She always said it should go to the woman who brought life back to our home." He hesitated, then added softly, "That's what you've done, Bethany. You've brought life back to this place, to me." Tears pricked at her eyes as she opened the locket to find it empty, waiting for memories yet to be made. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Xavier assured her. "It's yours, no strings attached, just to thank you for all you've done." Bethany closed the locket and held it out to him, turning so her back was to him. "Will you help me put it on?" Xavier's fingers were surprisingly nimble as he fastened the delicate chain around her neck, his touch lingering at her nape. When she turned back to face him, his expression was one of barely contained emotion. "I have something for you too," she said, retrieving her own gift from where she had hidden it behind a cushion. Xavier unwrapped the scarf, his appreciation evident as he immediately wrapped it around his neck. "It's perfect," he said, his voice husky. "No one's made me anything in years." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Bethany found herself leaning toward him, drawn by a force she couldn't resist. Xavier met her halfway, his hand coming up to cup her cheek as their lips met in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deepened with shared hunger. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for months," he confessed. "Why didn't you?" Bethany asked, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart. "I wasn't sure if you were ready," he said. "After everything you've been through, I didn't want to push." Bethany smiled, appreciation for his consideration warming her heart. "I'm ready now," she assured him, pressing another brief kiss to his lips to prove her point. They stayed by the fire late into the night, talking of small things and large, sharing kisses and caresses that spoke of affection rather than mere desire. When they finally parted to their separate rooms, it was with reluctance tempered by the knowledge that they had time to let their relationship unfold naturally. As winter gave way to spring, Bethany and Xavier grew closer, their days filled with shared work and their evenings with growing intimacy. They had not yet become lovers in the fullest sense, both silently agreeing to wait until their feelings were declared openly, their intentions clear. That declaration came on a mild April day as they picnicked beside a creek that ran through Xavier's property. The water was high with snowmelt, the banks green with new growth. Bethany had prepared fried chicken and biscuits, Xavier's favorite meal. "I need to ask you something," Xavier said as they lingered over the remains of their lunch. His expression was serious, almost nervous. Bethany set aside her cup of lemonade, suddenly alert. "What is it?" Xavier took her hand, his calloused thumb tracing circles on her palm. "These past months with you have been the happiest I've known since before Catherine died," he began. "You're strong, kind, beautiful. Everything a man could want in a partner." Bethany's heart began to race, hope blossoming in her chest. "I know it hasn't been a year since your husband died," Xavier continued, "and maybe this is too soon, improper even. But life out here is too uncertain to waste time on conventions when your heart is sure." He drew a deep breath, then met her eyes directly. "I love you, Bethany. I want to marry you if you'll have me." Though she had begun to anticipate his proposal, the reality of it, the sincerity in his voice, the love in his eyes overwhelmed her. Tears spilled down her cheeks, too powerful to contain. "Oh, Xavier," she whispered, squeezing his hand tightly. "I love you too, so much." Relief and joy transformed his face. "Is that a yes?" Bethany nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. Xavier gathered her into his arms, holding her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. "I don't have a ring yet," he said against her hair. "But we can ride into town tomorrow, pick one out together." "I don't need a ring," Bethany assured him. "Just you and this life we're building." Xavier pulled back to look at her, his expression serious once more. "Are you sure about marrying me? I know I'm not a wealthy man, and this ranch is modest compared to what some others have, but I promise to work hard every day to make you happy." Bethany placed her hand on his cheek, touched by his concern. "Xavier, when you found me in that barn, I was as close to death as a person can be. Not just physically, but in my soul. Harold had taken everything from me, my dignity, my freedom, nearly my life. I had nothing left." She took a steadying breath, determined to make him understand. "But then you came and you said those words I'll never forget, 'You're home now.' And somehow I knew it was true, not because of the ranch or the house, but because of you." "You're my home, Xavier Whitfield. Wherever you are, that's where I belong." Xavier's eyes shone with unshed tears as he pulled her close again, sealing their declaration with a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the town church, with Mrs. Carter, Sheriff Tanner, and a handful of neighbors as witnesses. Bethany wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Carter had helped her make, with lace salvaged from an old tablecloth and pearl buttons that had once belonged to Xavier's mother. The silver locket hung around her neck, now containing a small photograph of Xavier on one side, the other waiting for future memories. Their wedding night was a revelation for Bethany. Harold had treated intimacy as his right, taking what he wanted with little regard for her pleasure. With Xavier, it was different, a mutual giving and receiving, tender and passionate by turns. For the first time, Bethany understood what it meant to truly be one with another person, body and soul united in love. Spring turned to summer, the ranch thriving under their joint care. Xavier expanded the herd, while Bethany enlarged the garden and added a flock of chickens that produced more eggs than they could eat, the surplus providing a small but steady income at the town market. In August, Bethany received a letter from her sister in St. Louis, responding to the note Bethany had sent after her marriage. The reconciliation was tentative but promising, with her sister expressing a desire to visit the following spring. The prospect of reconnecting with her only remaining family member added to Bethany's growing happiness. By fall, Bethany was certain she was with child. The signs were unmistakable, though she waited to share the news with Xavier until she was absolutely sure. On the anniversary of the day he had found her in the barn, she finally told him. They had ridden out to a hilltop overlooking the ranch, the same spot where he had proposed months earlier. The aspens were turning gold, the air crisp with the promise of winter. "I have news," Bethany said, her hand unconsciously resting on her still flat stomach. "News that I hope will make you as happy as it has made me." Xavier looked at her expectantly, his hat in his hands, the breeze ruffling his dark hair. "We're going to have a baby," she announced, watching his face carefully. "In spring, around April, I think." For a moment, Xavier seemed frozen, his expression unreadable. Then, with a whoop of joy that startled the horses, he swept her into his arms, spinning her around before setting her gently back on her feet. "A baby," he repeated, awe and excitement mingling in his voice. "Our baby." His hand joined hers over her stomach, protective and reverent. "Are you feeling well? Should you be riding? Do you need to rest more?" Bethany laughed, placing her fingers over his lips to stem the flood of questions. "I'm perfectly fine," she assured him. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, most of them working right up until their time comes." Xavier nodded, though the concern didn't leave his eyes. "Still, you'll take it easy. Let me handle the heavier chores." "If it will make you feel better," she agreed, knowing this was a battle not worth fighting. Xavier's protective instincts were part of what she loved about him. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over their land, Xavier took her hand, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about names," he said. "If it's a girl, what about Catherine, after my first wife?" He hurried on before she could respond. "It's just, she would have loved to have children, and it seems a way to honor her memory." Bethany squeezed his hand, touched by his thoughtfulness. "I think that's beautiful," she said sincerely. "Catherine Whitfield has a lovely ring to it." Relief softened Xavier's features. "And if it's a boy," he asked. Bethany considered for a moment. "What about Thomas after my father, Thomas Xavier Whitfield?" "Perfect," Xavier agreed, leaning over to kiss her softly. "Either way, this child will be loved beyond measure." The winter months passed with Xavier hovering like a mother hen, insisting Bethany rest more and lift less. She humored him to a point, but maintained enough independence to keep from going stir-crazy. Her body changed with the growing child, her dresses requiring adjustment, her movements becoming more deliberate as her center of gravity shifted. Xavier watched these changes with wonder and occasional alarm. reading every book on childbirth he could get his hands on and peppering Mrs. Carter with questions whenever she visited. The widow, who had raised 5 children of her own, took his concern in stride, assuring him that Bethany was as healthy as a horse and likely to have an easy time of it. First babies sometimes take their time, Mrs. Carter warned in March, as Bethany's due date approached. Don't be surprised if April comes and goes with no sign. But the baby, like its mother, proved to be determined. Labor began on the first day of April, a mild spring morning with birds singing outside the window. Bethany was hanging laundry when the first pain struck, sharp and unmistakable, Mrs. Carter, who had been staying with them for the past week in anticipation of this moment, took charge immediately, sending Xavier for hot water and clean linens while she helped Bethany to bed. Men are useless at times like these, she muttered, though there was affection in her tone. He'll pace and worry and get underfoot, best to keep him busy. The labor was long but straightforward, Bethany drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Mrs. Carter was a calm presence, encouraging and reassuring through the worst of the pain. Xavier, banned from the bedroom after his third anxious inquiry in as many minutes, wore a path in the kitchen floor with his pacing. When the first cry of the infant finally pierced the air shortly after midnight, he froze, his head snapping up toward the bedroom door. Mrs. Carter emerged a few minutes later, her face wreathed in smiles. "You have a daughter, Mr. Whitfield," she announced, "a beautiful, healthy girl with a fine set of lungs." Xavier swayed slightly, emotion overwhelming him. "And Bethany?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Tired but well, Mrs. Carter assured him. "She's asking for you." The sight of Bethany propped up in their bed, their daughter cradled in her arms, was one Xavier would remember until his dying day. She looked exhausted but radiant, her hair damp with sweat, her face glowing with an inner light that took his breath away. "Meet your daughter," Bethany said softly as he approached the bed. "Catherine Rose Whitfield." Xavier sat carefully beside them, one finger gently stroking the downy dark hair on his daughter's head. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion, "just like her mother." Catherine grew rapidly, a happy child with her mother's blonde hair and her father's blue eyes. She brought a new dimension to their lives, filling the ranch house with laughter and the innocent chaos that comes with a curious toddler. Bethany thrived as a mother, her confidence growing as she navigated the challenges of raising a child in the sometimes harsh frontier environment. Xavier proved to be an attentive father, often carrying Catherine with him as he did his chores, explaining the workings of the ranch to her, as though she could understand every word. On Catherine's second birthday, another letter arrived from Bethany's sister, this one containing unexpected news. Their maternal grandmother had passed away, leaving Bethany a modest inheritance. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to make a significant difference in their lives. "We could build a proper house," Xavier suggested that night as they discussed how to use the money. "Something bigger with room for more children." Bethany smiled at the implication. They had been talking about expanding their family, though nature had yet to bless them with a second child. "I'd like that," she agreed, "and perhaps hire some help for the ranch. You work too hard as it is." Xavier nodded, his mind clearly already planning. A couple of good hands would make a world of difference, especially during calving and branding. The changes came gradually over the next year. A new house rose beside the old cabin, larger and more comfortable, but still modest by Eastern standards. 2 young men from town were hired to help with the ranch work, allowing Xavier to spend more time with his family and focus on expanding their operation. The inheritance also allowed Bethany to fulfill a dream she had harbored since coming to the ranch, starting a small school for the children of neighboring homesteads. Using the old cabin as a classroom, she began teaching 3 days a week with Catherine, now 3, as her youngest pupil. Life settled into a new pattern, busier but deeply satisfying. The ranch prospered, the school grew, and their marriage deepened with each passing season. The only shadow on their happiness was the continued absence of a second child, though they had stopped actively trying, accepting that perhaps Catherine would be their only one. Then, in the winter of 1881, 5 years after Xavier had found Bethany in that barn, the miracle they had stopped hoping for occurred. Bethany discovered she was expecting again, the news coming as a joyful surprise in the midst of a particularly harsh January. "Are you sure?" Xavier asked when she told him, hope and caution warring in his expression. Bethany nodded, her hand resting on her stomach. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. He says everything looks perfectly normal." This pregnancy was different from the first, more tiring, with occasional bouts of dizziness that Dr. Miller assured her were not uncommon for women in their 30s. Bethany cut back on her teaching, allowing Mrs. Carter's eldest daughter to take over 2 of the 3 weekly sessions. Xavier was, if possible, even more protective than he had been during her first pregnancy, constantly finding excuses to check on her during the day and insisting she rest whenever possible. Bethany accepted his concern with good grace, knowing it stemmed from love. In late August, as the wheat in the fields turned golden and the apples in their small orchard began to ripen, Bethany went into labor 2 weeks earlier than expected. This time, the process was quicker but more intense, leaving her exhausted and weak. When the baby, a boy, emerged silent and blue, fear gripped the room. Dr. Miller, who had arrived just in time for the birth, worked quickly, clearing the tiny airways and rubbing the infant's chest until finally a thin cry broke the tension. "He's a fighter," the doctor declared, wrapping the baby in a clean blanket before placing him in Bethany's arms. Small but strong. They named him Thomas Xavier as they had decided years before, though they called him Tomas for short. He was smaller than Catherine had been, with a shock of dark hair and serious eyes that seemed to take in the world with caution. The first months of Tomas's life were anxious ones, as he struggled to gain weight and was prone to colic that kept the entire household awake for nights on end. Bethany, recovering slowly from the difficult birth, pushed herself to the limit caring for him while trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Catherine. Xavier stepped in whenever he could, often walking the floor with Tomas through the night so Bethany could rest. When she developed a fever in October, he insisted on bringing in a young woman from town to help with the children and household, ignoring Bethany's protests that they could manage. "You nearly died bringing him into this world," Xavier said firmly when they were alone. "I won't risk losing you now to exhaustion or illness, not when I can prevent it." The honesty in his voice silenced her objections. For all his quiet strength, Xavier still carried the scars of his first wife's death, the fear of losing someone he loved never entirely absent. Gradually, things improved. Tomas began to thrive, filling out and developing the sturdy build that would eventually make him the image of his father. Bethany's health returned, along with her energy and spirits. By Christmas, the household had found its new balance, the family of 4 settling into routines that accommodated everyone's needs. On Christmas Eve, after the children were asleep and presents arranged beneath the small pine trees Xavier had cut from their land, husband and wife sat before the fire, enjoying a rare moment of peace. "You ever think about that night?" Bethany asked suddenly. "The night you found me." Xavier's hand tightened around hers. "Often," he admitted. "Especially around this time of year. I still don't know what made me check that barn. I was tracking a stray horse, but something pulled me there." Bethany leaned against his shoulder, the warmth of his body comforting in the quiet room. "I've never told you this," she said softly, "but I think I was praying when you found me. Not consciously, perhaps, but in my heart, praying for someone." Xavier turned to look at her, his expression solemn in the firelight. "I'm glad I was the answer," he said simply. Bethany reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that 5 years had added around his eyes. "You were more than that," she whispered. "You were my salvation, my new beginning." He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "We saved each other," he corrected. "You brought life back to this place to me when I thought that part of me had died with Catherine. You gave me a family again, a future to look forward to." Bethany smiled, thinking of their children asleep upstairs, of the school she had started, of the ranch that was now truly a home. "We've built something good here," she said, contentment filling her voice. "The best is yet to come," Xavier promised, drawing her into his arms for a kiss that still held the power to make her heart race, even after all these years. As the fire crackled and snow began to fall outside, Bethany Evans Whitfield closed her eyes, grateful beyond words for the second chance at life and love that had begun in the unlikeliest of places, a darkened barn on a night when hope seemed lost. From that moment of despair had grown this life of joy, proving that even in the harshest landscapes, love could take root and flourish. "You're home now," Xavier had said that night, and he had been right. Home wasn't a place, it was this feeling, this certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with the people she was meant to love. Home was Xavier's arms around her, their children's laughter, the life they had built together from the ashes of their separate tragedies. Home, Bethany knew with absolute certainty, was here,